The world more than 2.5 millennia ago was one of shifting borders, restless ambitions, and ceaseless conflict. The Chinese landscape of the spring and autumn period was not yet a unified empire, but rather a vast chessboard of rival states, each vying for power, prestige, and survival. Kings schemed against kings, warlords gathered soldiers under banners stitched with ancient symbols, and farmers turned into warriors when their lords called. It was in this turbulent age, where survival demanded cunning as much as courage, that a figure emerged whose ideas would echo across centuries. His name was Sun Tzu, though much about him remains wrapped in mystery. Was he a single man, a general of flesh and blood, or a composite voice for generations of strategists? While scholars still debate, the legacy attributed to him has become immortal, for in the lines of a slender volume known as The Art of War, the mind of a general was laid bare with a clarity that transcended time. The story begins in the state of Wu, a land along the lower reaches of the Yangtze River, known in antiquity for its marshes and waterways. Wu was not one of the traditional great powers of China, but rather a challenger on the periphery, ambitious and restless. Its king, He Lu, sought to expand his state's influence against stronger neighbors like Chu, and he looked for minds as sharp as swords to help him. Sun Tzu arrived in this court, not as a famed warrior covered in scars, but as a thinker whose reputation traveled with whispers and manuscripts. He carried not only the experience of command, but also a philosophy that war was not merely a clash of arms, but a contest of perception, psychology, and deception. Legend holds that King He Lu, skeptical of this quiet strategist, tested him in a way designed to mock. He commanded Sun Tzu to demonstrate his theories by drilling the king's concubines, women who had never held weapons, into disciplined soldiers. The king laughed at the absurdity, but Sun Tzu accepted. He divided them into two groups, set commanders from among them, and ordered the drills to begin. At first the women giggled, treating the commands as a game, but Sun Tzu's expression did not soften. He reminded them that when orders are unclear, the fault lies with the general. But once clarity is given, disobedience is the soldier's burden. He repeated his instructions. When laughter again disrupted the drills, he acted with severity. The story says he ordered the execution of the two leading concubines, favorites of the king, to make his point that discipline was not optional, even in demonstration. Though He Lu protested, Sun Tzu insisted the general's duty was to enforce command, not to humor the ruler. The women, terrified, now drilled with perfect precision. What began as a jest ended as a lesson in authority, and He Lu, though shaken, understood. Sun Tzu was not merely a theorist, he was a commander of iron will, and under his guidance, the armies of Wu could be transformed into a weapon. From this moment, the path of Wu shifted. With Sun Tzu as general, the state began campaigns that astonished its neighbors. Against the powerful state of Chu, long considered untouchable, Wu marched with strategies devised in shadows, attacks that struck where least expected, retreats that were but feints for greater blows. Sun Tzu understood terrain like a sculptor understands stone. He knew that rivers could be allies, that mountains could be traps, that the enemy's hunger and weariness could become deadlier than spears. His art was not in brute strength, but in using the weight of the enemy against himself, like a reed bending in the storm until the storm exhausted itself. Yet Sun Tzu was not only a commander in the field, he was a philosopher of war, and he distilled his experience into the writings that would become The Art of War. In it, he argued that the greatest victory was the one achieved without battle, that subduing the enemy's mind was superior to breaking his body. He wrote of deception as the cornerstone of strategy. Appear weak when you are strong, and strong when you are weak. He taught that knowing both yourself and your enemy was the surest path to triumph, while ignorance was a guarantee of defeat. To him, war was not about slaughter but about balance, an understanding of momentum, timing, and the human spirit. Through these principles, Sun Tzu elevated warfare beyond chaos into calculation. He envisioned armies not as mobs, but as extensions of a single will, coordinated and disciplined. He understood the importance of morale, the psychology of fear, and the necessity of adaptability. For him, No plan was sacred. Only the principle of victory mattered. If deception, patience, or sudden fury achieved it, then so be it. His philosophy blurred the line between war and diplomacy, for he believed that the clever general won by shaping the battlefield before the first arrow was loosed. Under his influence, Wu's fortunes soared. Battles once thought unwinnable became triumphs. The mighty Chu was humbled, its vast armies broken by stratagems they never anticipated. Wu became a force that reshaped the balance of the Chinese states, and Sun Tzu's name grew in reputation. But more than his victories, it was his ideas that endured. While the states around him fought with the desperation of survival, Sun Tzu looked deeper, seeing conflict not as random but as a system governed by patterns, rules, and choices. In an age when the clash of chariots and the cries of warriors defined power, he brought a vision of war as an art, a discipline that could be studied, mastered, and perfected. The man himself remains elusive, shrouded in both legend and silence. We know him through his words more than his life, and that itself may have been deliberate, for in his philosophy, the individual mattered less than the principles. A general should be as invisible as his strategies, leaving the enemy confounded, unable to grasp where the true hand of command lay. His book, short yet profound, carried seeds that would spread not only through China, but across the world. From emperors to samurai, from Napoleon to modern military academies, the shadow of Sun Tzu has stretched across cultures and centuries. As the wars of the spring and autumn period raged on, Sun Tzu's presence represented a shift in the very meaning of power. Armies no longer depended solely on the weight of numbers or the courage of warriors. They depended on the clarity of thought, on foresight and cunning. Wu itself would rise and fall like all states of that turbulent age, but the strategist it gave to history never faded. His words became a compass, not only for generals but for rulers, diplomats, and even merchants. Wherever there was conflict, there was a place for his art. And so the tale of Sun Tzu begins not in triumph but in transformation, an obscure strategist proving his theories, a king skeptical until convinced, a state at the margins turning into a force through the discipline of ideas. It is here in the meeting of philosophy and battlefield that the foundation of his legacy was laid. A foundation so enduring that millennia later, we still speak his name, seeking in his words guidance for struggles far removed from the fields of ancient China. His story, like his strategies, unfolds in layers, each revealing not only the mind of a general, but the heart of an age where survival demanded brilliance. When Sun Tzu assumed command of Wu's armies, he inherited not the largest force in China, nor the wealthiest treasury, but a kingdom poised at the edge of ambition. Wu was a state dismissed by its neighbors as peripheral, a land of marshes and river crossings, where its warriors were more accustomed to navigating boats than to riding in ornate chariots. Yet in that very geography lay opportunity. To Sun Tzu, terrain was not merely ground to be fought over, but a living ally to be shaped, exploited, and turned against the unsuspecting enemy. The campaigns that followed demonstrated the sharpness of his vision. Against the state of Chu, the colossus of southern China, Wu stood seemingly outmatched. Chu was older, richer, and larger, its armies vast, its kings proud. To march against Chu appeared reckless, but Sun Tzu's genius was not in contesting strength with strength. He taught that one must strike where the enemy least expects, that surprise can unmake an army before blades ever cross. Wu's soldiers, drilled with discipline and hardened by belief in their general, moved with uncanny precision, slipping through waterways and forested passes, appearing where Chu's commanders thought impossible. In one campaign, Chu's forces gathered in overwhelming numbers, confident that Wu could not withstand them. Yet Sun Tzu studied their disposition, their long supply lines stretching over rivers and hills, their soldiers weary from the weight of their own abundance. He waited for their confidence to become complacency. Then, striking suddenly at vulnerable outposts, he cut their lifelines and left their army divided. Confusion spread faster than arrows. Chu's commanders, expecting Wu to stand and fight in pitched battle, found themselves facing an enemy that seemed everywhere and nowhere at once. Defeat followed not from the might of Wu's soldiers, but from the collapse of Chu's own certainty. This was Sun Tzu's mastery: war without waste, victory with minimal cost. To him, The general who squandered lives in pursuit of glory was no general at all. His aim was not conquest through slaughter but triumph through precision, a clean strike that rendered resistance meaningless. He wrote that to win 100 battles is not the pinnacle of skill. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the true measure of greatness. And in Wu's campaigns, we see this philosophy come alive. Wu's rise alarmed its neighbors. States that had once ignored the marshland kingdom now felt the sting of its ambition. Yet Sun Tzu counseled caution as well as daring. He understood that wars could devour nations from within, that extended campaigns drained treasuries, starved peasants, and eroded loyalty. He urged that war must be swift, decisive, and above all purposeful. When Wu marched, it was not to display its strength, but to achieve specific, calculated goals. One of his most remarkable qualities as a commander was his ability to see war as part of a larger web of politics and human behavior. He studied not only armies, but the minds of kings, the temper of allies, the fractures within enemy courts. He believed that the best victories came before the armies even met, when an opponent could be divided from within, when alliances could be disrupted, when fear itself could weaken resolve. In this, he blurred the line between general and statesman. Warfare to Sun Tzu was diplomacy by other means, a continuation of politics through strategy rather than brute force. His campaigns against Chu reveal this subtlety. By exploiting rivalries within the Chu court and spreading misinformation, he weakened the bonds of trust among their leaders. Commanders who did not trust one another faltered in the field. Officers who feared betrayal hesitated at crucial moments. In one sense, Sun Tzu fought two wars at once, one with spears and arrows, and another in the minds of his adversaries. Both were equally decisive. Wu's victories under his command reshaped the map of the spring and autumn period. For a time, Wu stood among the most feared of states, its reputation far exceeding its size. Yet even in success, Sun Tzu warned of the dangers of hubris. He wrote that the wise general does not press a desperate foe too hard, for cornered men fight with the strength of despair. He advised that battles should end not in annihilation but in leverage, victories turned into political advantage rather than endless bloodshed. It was advice that few rulers in history would heed, and yet it remains one of the most enduring lessons of his philosophy. But while the campaigns brought glory, they also highlighted the fragile balance of Sun Tzu's world. The spring and autumn period was an age where no state could remain dominant for long. Alliances shifted like river currents, and today's ally might become tomorrow's enemy. Wu itself, for all its triumphs, would eventually falter under pressures both external and internal. Still, the campaigns of Sun Tzu revealed a vision of warfare unlike anything seen before. He had shown that discipline, preparation, and cunning could overcome raw numbers, that the mind was the ultimate weapon on the battlefield. As we follow the arc of his career, we see more than battles. We see the shaping of a philosophy that outlived its time. His campaigns in Wu were not merely about conquest, they were experiments in applying his principles. Each victory reinforced the truths he wrote in The Art of War. Each maneuver became a lesson in the eternal laws of conflict. That war is deception, that strength lies in adaptability, and that true mastery is invisible, felt but not seen. And yet, even as his name spread, Sun Tzu himself remained an enigma. Accounts of his life are sparse, fragments preserved in chronicles written centuries later. Perhaps this was fitting. The man who valued invisibility left few traces of himself. His presence felt more in the enduring shadow of his ideas than in the details of his biography. Some later scholars would even question whether he was real, or whether The Art of War was the work of many minds, a crystallization of collective wisdom given form in a single name. But in the campaigns of Wu, the legend finds its most tangible anchor. There, in the rise of a once-overlooked state, we glimpse the mind of a general at work. By the time his campaigns had shifted the balance of power, Sun Tzu's teachings were already spreading beyond the borders of Wu. Students of strategy, rulers of rival states, and wandering scholars carried his words, copied his principles, and adapted them to their own struggles. His book was not a mere manual for soldiers. It was a philosophy of conflict applicable to every arena of human endeavor. Where there was competition, rivalry, or struggle, His words found resonance. Thus, the campaigns of Wu are remembered not only as feats of military brilliance, but as the proving ground of ideas destined to travel across centuries. They marked the moment when warfare ceased to be seen as blind destruction and began to be understood as an art form, governed by principles as enduring as mathematics, as subtle as poetry. Sun Tzu's legacy was born in the marshes of Wu, forged in battles against Chu, but it would not remain confined to that time or place. From there, his vision would ripple outward, crossing dynasties, cultures, and continents. For now, though, we remain in the world of the spring and autumn period, where the clang of bronze weapons echoes across fields, where banners rise and fall with the seasons, and where a single general through thought as much as steel rewrites the meaning of victory. As the dust of campaigns settled and Wu stood taller among the rival states of China, Sun Tzu turned from battlefield maneuvers to something more enduring. Victory, he knew, could vanish with the turning of seasons. A state that was strong today could be humbled tomorrow. But ideas had the power to transcend the rise and fall of kingdoms. It was in this moment that he gave form to the work that would outlast him, a collection of 13 chapters that distilled the essence of war into words, The Art of War. The book was unlike anything of its time. Earlier treatises on warfare in China had listed formations, weapon types, and ceremonial protocols, but Sun Tzu's work was different. It was not a manual of technicalities, but a philosophy, a way of thinking about conflict that was as much psychological as it was martial. His words were concise, his insights layered, each line a principle meant to be pondered and adapted. Like the strokes of a brush in calligraphy, each phrase carried both simplicity and depth, inviting endless interpretation. The opening chapter set the tone, declaring that war was a matter of vital importance to the state, the path of survival or ruin. It was not something to be taken lightly, nor something to be waged without calculation. He emphasized 5 constant factors: moral influence, weather, terrain, command, and doctrine, that determined the outcome of war. Already he revealed his unique perspective. Victory was not only about strength of arms, but about harmony of people, alignment of leadership, and the ability to read both the heavens and the earth. In later chapters, he unfolded principles that would astonish generations. He insisted that the supreme art of war was to subdue the enemy without fighting, a radical departure from the blood-soaked traditions of conquest. To him, the clever general arranged circumstances so that battle became unnecessary, the enemy undone by their own missteps before a single sword was drawn. He praised deception, urging commanders to mask their intentions, to create illusions that would lead opponents astray. He counseled adaptability, reminding readers that just as water takes the shape of the ground it flows over, so too must armies shape themselves to the conditions they face. Perhaps the most enduring passages were those on knowledge. To know oneself and the enemy, he argued, was the surest path to victory. Ignorance, by contrast, was the road to ruin. These words transcended the battlefield, for they spoke to the universal truth of preparation, awareness, and insight. It is this universality that allowed the art of war to become more than a military manual. It became a guide for statesmen, merchants, and thinkers across all walks of life. The structure of the book reflected Sun Tzu's methodical mind. Each of the 13 chapters addressed a core aspect of warfare: planning, waging war, stratagem, disposition of forces, use of energy, strengths and weaknesses, maneuvering, variation, marching, terrain, types of ground, fire attacks, and the role of spies. Together they formed a holistic system, a web of interconnected ideas. Yet Sun Tzu never claimed they were rigid laws. On the contrary, he emphasized flexibility. He wrote that no fixed method can guarantee success, for circumstances change without warning. And the wise commander adapts like a reed bending to the wind. This emphasis on flexibility marked a break from rigid traditions. Many rulers of the time still believed in fixed codes of honor, in predetermined formations, in the idea that courage alone could determine the outcome of battle. Sun Tzu dismissed such notions as folly. Courage mattered, yes, but discipline mattered more. Formations had their place, but only when they suited the ground and the moment. He saw war not as ceremony, but as survival, a contest of minds as much as weapons. What made his book remarkable was not only its content, but its timelessness. Written in an age of chariots and bronze, it spoke in terms so abstract that its truths remained relevant even when iron replaced bronze, when gunpowder replaced arrows, when aircraft replaced horses. Because it was never bound to a single technology, it remained applicable across ages. The principles of deception, knowledge, and adaptability could guide a general in ancient China, a daimyo in medieval Japan, a general in Napoleonic France, or even a strategist in the modern world. Within his lifetime, the art of war began to circulate beyond Wu. Scholars copied it by hand, rulers sought it as a treasure, and students of military theory debated its meaning. It became part of the intellectual fabric of the warring states period that followed, an era when countless kingdoms fought for supremacy and strategy was prized above brute strength. The book was consulted not only by generals, but by kings, who saw in its pages a mirror of their own political struggles. What is striking is how Sun Tzu's ideas blurred boundaries between war and peace. His assertion that the greatest victory was won without fighting resonated deeply with rulers who sought to expand influence without draining their treasuries or risking their thrones. Diplomats applied his principles in negotiations, merchants in competition, even scholars in debate. The Art of War became less a book about war than a book about conflict in its broadest sense, a guide to overcoming obstacles and outmaneuvering rivals in every domain of human life. And yet, in all its wisdom, the book carried a cold realism. Sun Tzu did not shy from the brutality of war. He recognized that it brought suffering, that prolonged campaigns devastated people, that unchecked ambition could consume entire states. His warnings were sharp. No nation benefits from prolonged warfare. Victory must be swift. He saw the danger of rulers interfering with generals, of armies being driven by vanity rather than necessity. His words were not lofty idealism, but practical, often ruthless truths designed to save lives through efficiency. In many ways, he sought to minimize war's horrors by making it precise, controlled, and purposeful. The legacy of the art of war was already taking root as Sun Tzu's own world continued to shift. Wu itself, for all its brilliance, could not remain forever ascendant. Internal rivalries, external threats, and the ceaseless churn of the spring and autumn period would eventually erode its power. Yet even as Wu's fortunes waned, Sun Tzu's book endured. Unlike the fleeting banners of kings, the pages of his text could not be toppled in battle. They traveled, copied and recopied, whispering his insights into the ears of future generations. The power of his words lay in their adaptability. To one reader, they offered guidance in military command. To another, they suggested lessons in leadership and politics. To still another, they revealed the psychology of conflict in human nature itself. Few works in history have managed such breadth, and fewer still have done so with such brevity. For the Art of War is not a lengthy tome, but a slender text, yet within its sparse lines lies a universe of meaning. It is here, in the creation of this book, that Sun Tzu's greatness truly reveals itself. Victories on the battlefield fade, remembered only in chronicles and ruins, but the victory of thought endures, echoing across centuries. Sun Tzu secured his place in history not merely by winning wars for Wu, but by capturing the essence of strategy in words so precise they would never lose their relevance. He transformed the chaos of war into a discipline, a study as rigorous as any philosophy, as enduring as any art. Thus, as Wu rose and fell, Sun Tzu's legacy grew. From the marshlands of the Yangtze to the scrolls of scholars, from the ears of kings to the minds of generals, his voice continued to speak. And though his life would end, the book he left behind became immortal, a silent general commanding the thoughts of men long after his armies had vanished. The spring and autumn period gave way to an age even more turbulent, the era historians would call the Warring States. 7 great kingdoms emerged, locked in a relentless struggle for dominance, each striving to become the single power that would unify all of China. The wars of this time were longer, more ruthless, and fought with ever larger armies. Cities were fortified, iron replaced bronze, and military innovations changed the face of battle. Yet in the midst of this chaos, the teachings of Sun Tzu found new life, shaping the strategies of generals and the ambitions of kings. In this brutal age, the lessons of the art of war were no mere philosophy, they were survival. The rulers of Qin, Zhao, Han, Wei, Chu, Yan, and Qi all sought wisdom that might give them an edge. Armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands clashed on the plains, and the cost of miscalculation could be annihilation. Sun Tzu's principles of deception, flexibility, and swiftness became guiding lights in campaigns where a single mistake could mean the destruction of a state. Generals of the warring states carried copies of his text, and strategists quoted his lines in council to their lords. Among them were figures who became legends in their own right: Wu Qi, the reformer who insisted on discipline and equality among soldiers and officers, and Sun Bin, said to be a descendant of Sun Tzu's own family, who applied the master's teachings with cunning brilliance. Sun Bin, maimed by rivals who crushed his legs in political intrigue, nevertheless rose to prominence as a strategist. His most famous victory came at the Battle of Meiling, where he lured a vastly superior Wei army into ambush through deception, feigned retreat, and careful calculation. The principles at work were echoes of Sun Tzu's words: strike where the enemy is unprepared, create the appearance of weakness to draw him in, and use terrain as the silent ally of strategy. It was victories such as these that demonstrated how Sun Tzu's thought had become embedded in the very marrow of Chinese warfare. Armies did not merely march, they maneuvered like living organisms, shaped by strategy as much as by strength. Kings no longer saw war as a matter of simple valor. They recognized it as a science of manipulation, timing, and foresight. In this way, Sun Tzu's vision transformed not just battles, but the very nature of rulership. As centuries passed, Qin rose above its rivals under leaders who valued strategy as much as discipline. When Qin Shi Huang finally unified China in 221 BCE, he did so through relentless campaigns informed by cunning as much as might. Though the chronicles do not say that Sun Tzu's book guided every step, the principles he laid down had become part of the intellectual landscape of the age. To unify China required more than soldiers. It required deception, psychological pressure, and a grasp of the larger picture, all hallmarks of his philosophy. But Sun Tzu's influence did not end with Qin's empire. Dynasties rose and fell, each inheriting the intellectual treasures of those before. The Han dynasty, which succeeded Qin, preserved the art of war as one of its foundational military texts. It became part of the canon of strategy, studied not only by soldiers, but by scholars preparing for civil service examinations. For in Han times, governance and military affairs were intertwined, and the wisdom of Sun Tzu was seen as essential for any who would advise emperors or lead armies. The book's impact only deepened with time. Later dynasties treated it as scripture, binding it together with other classics of military thought into collections such as the 7 military classics. These works were required reading for generals, ensuring that Sun Tzu's voice echoed through court councils and battlefield tents for centuries. Whenever rebellion flared or foreign invaders pressed against China's borders, commanders returned to his principles: the value of knowing the enemy, the importance of swift and decisive action, the need to win not merely by arms, but by breaking the opponent's will. In the Tang dynasty, when China expanded its borders and engaged in campaigns across Central Asia, the art of war was consulted as both a practical guide and a source of timeless wisdom. During the Song dynasty, when China faced threats from the Khitan, Jurchen, and Mongols, strategists invoked Sun Tzu's warnings against protracted war, urging caution and precision against enemies who thrived on mobility. Even in the Ming and Qing dynasties, as gunpowder and cannons altered the face of combat, his teachings remained relevant because they spoke not of weapons, but of the eternal patterns of conflict. Beyond the battlefield, Sun Tzu's words seeped into the culture of governance itself. Emperors and ministers quoted his maxims in political disputes, likening rival factions at court to armies maneuvering for position. Poets referenced his lines to illuminate the struggles of human ambition. Merchants adopted his ideas of deception, timing, and knowing one's opponent to guide trade and negotiation. In this way, the art of war transcended its origins, becoming a cultural touchstone, a lens through which Chinese society interpreted not only war, but the very nature of human conflict. Yet even as his legacy grew, Sun Tzu himself became more of a shadow than a man. Generations debated whether he was one figure or many, whether the text attributed to him was his alone or the collected wisdom of strategists refined over time. But perhaps the truth mattered less than the impact. For whoever the man was, the book that bore his name became the single most influential work on strategy in all of Chinese history. And through the centuries, the paradox he set forth endured: that the greatest general is not the one who wins the most battles, but the one who achieves his aims without fighting at all. In an empire where the cycles of rebellion and invasion seemed endless, this vision of bloodless victory was a tantalizing ideal, a hope that wisdom could tame the chaos of human ambition. From the marshes of Wu to the imperial capitals of Xi'an and Luoyang, from the bamboo slips of the warring states to the printed pages of later dynasties, Sun Tzu's words traveled across generations. They became part of the identity of Chinese civilization itself, a reminder that thought could triumph over force, that the mind of a general could shape the destiny of nations. And yet his influence would not remain confined to China. As centuries turned and the world grew interconnected, the art of war began a journey beyond its homeland, carried across borders by scholars, traders, and conquerors. From the courts of Japan to the battlefields of Europe, Sun Tzu's voice would continue to whisper its lessons of deception, knowledge, and balance, guiding new generations of warriors far removed from the world in which he had lived. As China entered the medieval period and beyond, the words of Sun Tzu traveled far beyond the borders of the Middle Kingdom. Merchants, diplomats, and scholars carried his ideas along trade routes, and by the medieval era, his teachings had reached neighboring civilizations, where they were eagerly studied and adapted to new contexts. Japan, with its samurai culture, embraced the art of war not merely as a military manual, but as a moral guide, a text that linked the discipline of the sword to the discipline of the mind. Daimyo consulted its principles to structure armies, manage retainers, and wage campaigns with efficiency, deception, and timing. Japanese military thinkers marveled at Sun Tzu's insistence on flexibility and the manipulation of perception, seeing in it a resonance with Bushido, the code of honor that demanded both courage and cunning. In Korea and Vietnam, Sun Tzu's work also found its way into the strategy of court advisors and military commanders, shaping campaigns and defensive planning. But the journey of his ideas did not stop in East Asia. When European explorers, scholars, and missionaries began traversing Asia, they encountered the text, often through translation, and brought it back to the West. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the art of war began to permeate European military thought, influencing generals who were struggling with the challenges of organized, large-scale warfare. Its aphorisms, though centuries old, resonated with leaders facing new technologies, complex logistics, and the uncertainties of human behavior in battle. In Europe, the book was admired not for its exotic origin, but for its universal principles. Napoleon's strategists and military theorists studied its lessons on deception, the use of terrain, and the value of intelligence. Its emphasis on knowing the enemy and exploiting weakness found parallels in Western doctrines of maneuver warfare and operational planning. While the campaigns of Europe were fought with muskets and cannons rather than chariots and arrows, the psychology of command, the manipulation of perception, and the economy of force remained the same, and Sun Tzu's insights proved timeless. In modern times, his influence expanded even further. During the 20th century, armies in both world wars referenced his teachings, particularly in areas of planning, intelligence, and psychological operations. The concept of subduing the enemy without combat found expression in strategies of blockades, economic pressure, and political manipulation. Leaders from diverse nations drew on Sun Tzu's guidance to navigate conflicts that had grown global in scale and complexity. Even in the Cold War, when direct confrontation between superpowers could have catastrophic consequences, his principles of strategy, deception, and indirect approach became relevant once again. Beyond warfare, Sun Tzu's ideas infiltrated fields as unexpected as business, sports, and leadership studies. executives studied the art of war to outmaneuver competitors, negotiate contracts, and guide teams through uncertain markets. Athletes and coaches found parallels in strategy, timing, and preparation. Negotiators used his principles of knowledge, anticipation, and psychological insight to gain advantage without direct confrontation. In this way, the legacy of a general from a distant, ancient kingdom continued to shape human behavior in arenas far removed from the battlefield. The reason for Sun Tzu's enduring power lies in his fundamental insight. That conflict, whether fought with swords or words, is determined as much by perception, discipline, and intelligence as by raw strength. He revealed that victory comes not to the strongest or the bravest, but to the wisest, the most adaptable, the most patient, and the most cunning. His teachings remind us that strategy is universal because human nature is universal. Ambition, fear, deception, and calculation shape every encounter, from the battlefield to the boardroom. And yet, despite centuries of reverence and application, the man behind the book remains almost mythic. Sun Tzu's biography is fragmentary, a collage of legend, anecdote, and historical record. The stories of him drilling concubines, of quietly observing terrain while armies marched past, of devising ambushes that confounded giants, all these give us a portrait not just of a general, but of a mind uniquely attuned to the rhythms of power and human behavior. Some historians question whether he was a single individual or a figure representing the accumulated wisdom of generations. But that ambiguity has done nothing to diminish the clarity of his message. Today, when we call Sun Tzu the greatest general in history, it is not merely because of battles won or enemies defeated. It is because he redefined what it meant to command, to lead, and to understand conflict. He taught that the essence of war is not destruction, but control, not chaos but order, not brute force but foresight. His greatness lies in vision, in the ability to see the invisible, the weaknesses of the enemy, the uncertainty of circumstance, the fleeting advantages that can decide outcomes. His art is timeless because it addresses not the weapons of a particular era, but the eternal dynamics of strategy, psychology, and human decision-making. Even in the modern age of precision-guided munitions, cyber warfare, and global diplomacy, Sun Tzu's words resonate. Military academies across the world continue to teach his lessons. Business schools analyze his maxims. Leaders consult his strategies in crises both public and private. He has become a universal symbol of the power of intellect over impulse, of planning over chaos, of the mind's triumph over the sword. And so as the sun sets over the rivers and marshes of ancient Wu, we are reminded that the true battlefield of Sun Tzu's genius was not only the fields of China, but the world of ideas itself. His campaigns, his philosophy, and his book form a legacy that stretches across continents and millennia. He is remembered not for the fleeting victories of his armies, but for victories of thought, for a vision of war and strategy that continues to guide and inspire. In the end, Sun Tzu's greatness is inseparable from his subtlety. He showed that a general could be invisible yet decisive, that victory could come without bloodshed, that the mind could outfight the body. He taught that knowledge, patience, and insight are more potent than courage alone. And through the enduring journey of the art of war, he whispers across history to every strategist, leader, and thinker who seeks to master the unpredictable dance of conflict. Sun Tzu did not merely win battles, he won immortality. He became the archetype of the ultimate general, the one whose understanding transcends time, whose strategies are as relevant today as they were over 2,000 years ago, whose name continues to command respect across the world. The greatest general in history, not for the might of his armies, but for the depth of his mind, the clarity of his vision, and the enduring power of his ideas, remains Sun Tzu.